Breaking news out of Jerusalem at this hour, a final vote on that controversial bill, part of the judicial system overhaul. CNN's Hadass Gold is live for us now with the very latest. So Hadass, the vote, we were talking about the vote moving up a little more quickly than anticipated.
Yeah, the vote has actually now passed 64-0. This vote that will take away the Supreme Court's ability to stop government actions, declaring them unreasonable. It has passed. The reason it was 64-0 is because all the members of the opposition left the floor in protest to this vote. We are just outside the Supreme Court. Organizers here have set up big screens so that protesters can see what's happening on the Parliament, and you can hear that they are getting very loud, and they are actually all starting to walk down towards the Parliament building. They don't seem to be indicating that they're going to be leaving anytime soon, despite the fact that this passed. It appears that all attempts at last-minute negotiations failed. We know that there was lots of back and forth with the coalition and opposition to try to negotiate potentially a delay. Those appear to have failed. The government has managed to pass the first aspect of this massive judicial overhaul. This isn't the only part of the judicial overhaul. It's one bill of several. We're seeing on the screens of what's happening on the Parliament floor, coalition members congratulating each other, including Benjamin Netanyahu, just out of the hospital, actually, for a pacemaker that was just installed. He literally left the hospital this morning and came straight to the Parliament when this vote passed. Now, this does not mean necessarily that starting at this very moment, the Supreme Court cannot stop government actions. There are still several steps that need to be taken, and ironically, one of those steps is most likely an immediate legal challenge to this legislation, which will ironically be heard in front of the Supreme Court likely. Now, if the Supreme Court decides that this legislation cannot stand because it is ironically unreasonable in their eyes, then we are set up here for a major political crisis here for a country that has no written constitution. That's partly what's the issue here. Now, for these protesters, this passing, this they believe is the beginning of the end of an independent judiciary. This they believe is the beginning of government having unfettered power to do what it wants, because the Supreme Court is the only check on the government power here. I don't think that these protesters are going home anytime soon. I have a feeling we're going to be in for a very eventful next few hours as these protesters get potentially even more riled up, guys.
Hadass, what will happen now? Because Benjamin Netanyahu and those who supported it said the judiciary needed reform, it had too much power. Opponents say if you take away this sole check on the government, then you essentially have a dictatorship. So now exactly what happens once these bills pass?
So most likely what will happen, well, we know the Israel Bar Association has said they're going to file an immediate petition in front of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can file an injunction, a temporary injunction, stopping the legislation from being enforced. Now, that might happen. We have a feeling that that will happen. And then there will be a legal battle in front of the Supreme Court about whether this can stand. There's a lot of unanswered legal questions here, meddling questions here about what the legality of this will be. And I think also in the more immediate will be, keep in mind, thousands of military reservists have said they will not heed the call to serve if this legislation passes. This legislation has now passed. So now we're going to see whether they're going to live up to that pledge, whether if they get called up for service, if something happens on the north with Lebanon, if something happens with Gaza, if something happens even with Iran, will they call up, will they heed the call to get into their jets, to get into their tanks and serve as per their military reserve duty? And if they don't, will they be arrested? Will there be legal ramifications for them? These are all the questions now on the table because this legislation has now passed.
All right. Watching it very closely, Israel, of course, one of this country's closest allies. President Biden, of course, was very direct in where he stands on this and what he thinks should happen. Those words may have been heard, but it didn't certainly change anything, it does.
No, it didn't. And we've heard from President Biden now twice in the past week urging Netanyahu, urging Israeli leaders, take a step back, take time to come to a consensus. There's no need to rush this, have a negotiation. But clearly that pressure didn't seem to have much an effect. Now, remember, Benjamin Netanyahu has not yet been invited to the White House, not been yet invited officially for that big White House visit. This judicial overhaul was one of those potential reasons why. Now, we did hear from President Biden saying that they do, from the White House saying that they do expect Netanyahu and Biden to meet sometime in the U.S. soon. Now the question will be, this legislation has passed. There was no compromise negotiation. Will that invitation still stand? How will this affect U.S.-Israel relationships? The Israelis have been saying for the longest time, you know, this is our own internal debate. This has nothing to do with the United States. Our partnership with the United States is strong, especially when it comes to security issues. There's a lot of questions, though, now hanging, especially with all these military reservists saying that they will not serve. We have yet to hear, of course, from the White House on this legislation passing, since this has just happened in the last few minutes. But it could very easily affect U.S.-Israeli relations right now with all of this legal, political questions going on.
Absolutely. Hadass, really appreciate the reporting. So good to have you there on the ground.